Hey, I'm James West.
And I'm Jeff Zananieri.
And we're here with Matt Bottomley, the cannabis analyst from Canacord Genuity, and we're in pursuit of the next big cannabis deal. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey,
Matt, you've just put out quite an extensive piece on the state of the cannabis industry, and give us an overview of what is the essential tone of your piece.
Well, really, it's trying to line up what's happening from a macro level in the United States right now with all this different state legislation, whether it's medical and recreational programs, and lining that up with what's a growing list of what the industry calls multi-state operators. So operators are in, let's say, a dozen or so states right now, and just trying to line up who exactly has an edge where and where are these markets going. And I would say the overall thesis of this report is, with valuations down over 50% since 2019 highs, I think given some near-term catalysts like the DOJ potentially closing some of these large cap deals, the fact that the summer months are unfortunately now becoming behind us and there's more butts and shares, as I like to say, as well as I think overall positive Q2 earnings where companies are reaching profitability, I think this might be a great time to get ahead of some of those catalysts and take a deeper dive into these multi-state operator names.
Mm-hmm. So you see the future of the cannabis industry for investors as a primarily U.S. opportunity?
No, I think it's global, but I think when you look at what's happening internationally right now, the medical cannabis programs are still very nascent, whether it's in Germany, Australia, and then there's sort of the CBD or hemp-derived CBD health and wellness, all still at a very nascent stage right now. So it's hard to really get stories out there that can give investors confidence that there's going to be winners today that can be picked in those markets. I think in the U.S., it's the nearest term opportunity, given that state-by-state legislation for recreational purposes has been happening for about 5 or 6 years now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in terms of early stage private opportunities that individual investors don't necessarily get to see unless they're fortunate enough to be proximal to the opportunity, what are the sectors that you are focused on most on an early stage basis where you find them, the segment or the sector, a sort of risk acceptable opportunity?
Well, it depends. It's a pretty big question, because a lot of when I see certain opportunities like that, it has to do with doing general due diligence for whether it's just checking out a state, whether there's a big operator in that state that I'm touring. And I think that as cannabis acceptance continues to grow and as it becomes a little more legitimatized, if that's a word, I think that's something that you're going to see boats start rising with the tides, as they say. So what I've seen in interesting plays is extraction opportunities or one-off brands that like to maybe you need the working capital in order to really carve out a market share somewhere and combine with larger companies. And then it also depends on the region. Colorado right now is probably going to be a very, very interesting hotbed for private deals, because the legislation recently changed to allow public company ownership. So I think you're going to see, given that there's hundreds and hundreds of players there, some of these large multi-state operators go around and find sort of the winners that have key dispensaries there that can help their platform.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the area that you would expect that the big boys are going to go shopping in that sector, in dispensaries?
Yeah, I think right now retail is sort of the gatekeeper in order to get to the end user, and that's just a function of what the legislation allows. I don't see any reason why over the longer term it won't go to an Amazon model, or cannabis, if it becomes legalized at the federal level, will be allowed in more traditional retail stores, pharmacies and grocery stores like that. But I think right now, because it's such a closely held sector, state by state in terms of what's allowed, that right now retail is the only way to get to the consumer at scale. And because there really isn't a national brand winner yet, I mean, different regions have it, I think that's the best way to build goodwill right now, is to get strategic retail in important markets like California or Los Angeles, like MedMen does, or on the East Coast in Boston, like Columbia Care has good exposure there once that licensing comes on, or in Florida with Trulieve. These are the markets where I think national mind share can be won.
Mm-hmm. So you think that in the private side, there's still opportunities to focus on elements like localized market, a state market, as opposed to trying to be all things to all people right out of the chute?
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge that a lot of these billion-dollar companies have right now, is they're sort of trying to do everything at once because it's a bit of a foot race. So there's still a lot of private companies in the California market, I mentioned in Colorado, where the opportunity for potential capital that's been raised in the public market to be deployed through acquisitions or through other financings into the private sector is going to be for where the needs are as the market develops. So it could be delivery platforms. I know that there's a couple of big ones out of California. It could be, like I said, certain extraction companies that have a different niche in terms of how they extract it, or a following with their actual technologies or the output that they have from that. Or it could be any number of things. There's technology platforms for doing seed to sale tracking. So this is kind of the picks and shovel rationale for that, and I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities that come through various states as they become more and more advanced in building out their programs.
Sure. How big of an effect will the legalization of cannabis at the federal level in the United States have on valuations of U.S. MSOs and private companies, and when do you see that happening?
Well, I think timing's everything. So I think that as long as the average investor believes that it is an inevitability that it will occur, and I believe that will happen. I mean, we have 33 states that have legal cannabis in some form, and that's at an accelerating pace. I mean, there was really only a handful to talk about 6 or 7 years ago. So I think in that regard that federal legalization, or the prospect of it at some point down the road, let's call it 2 to 5 years, really allows the companies today to build up infrastructure and assets, and again, some mind share, where they could be huge candidates for the next Constellation Brands or Altria that wants to come into the space and maybe look at an MSO instead of a Canadian LP. The flip side of that is if it happens tomorrow, it would be terrible for valuations, because you really want to build the moat a little bit stronger than it is today. I still think we're close to that tipping point, but as we know, it's not going to happen tomorrow, so I think there's a bit of a relief there that all the MSOs have. But obviously, the multiple expansion is going to be significant as we get more clarity. It needs to be sort of another year or two out, so that different markets that are just starting to ramp up now can actually get, bear hug certain regions where they would have to be a takeout candidate as opposed to someone coming in fresh to compete.
Mm-hmm. Back of the napkin, we could say that there's roughly $200 billion in the global cannabis space, and that's including a rough estimate of private, so that's not a number that we can derive from data per se, but even that big a number, would you say that the future of the cannabis space, the biggest money, is still yet to be made?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the quickest money might have been made already, depending on how you look at the charts. Certainly, I was on vacation end of 2017 when the stocks were going up 30% every day. I don't know if we'll see that environment again, but who knows, stranger things have happened. But I think where we are in the actual cycle in terms of peak valuation, I think we're very far away from it. It's going to be different though, right? If you look back to the tech days, there was a tremendous bubble, a tremendous amount of companies that turned out not to really come into fruition, but that market cap and valuation eventually flowed into the big names like Google and Amazon and what we have today. So the market cap is actually significantly bigger in that sector compared to where it used to be. The allocation is much, much different, 180 degrees. I expect we might see some of that in the cannabis sector as winners and losers start to separate.
Mm-hmm. We're as concerned about oversaturation and what not to invest in, because we're really focused on like the turbocharged growth sectors, where the meat's still on the bone, so to speak. Is there anything you'd avoid with all this legislation rollout happening in the U.S.? Yeah,
I think not being vertically integrated is typically one of the big risks, particularly if you are a cultivator. I mean, the actual cannabis plant itself, there's a percentage of users, I'm sure, that are very artisan, and it really matters in terms of how the product is developed and grown and extracted. But if you're not sort of in that 5% of growers or extractors that maybe are competing for that market, it really is just a commodity. It's a raw material for recreational purposes. It's an API, if you want to consider it a medical pharmaceutical ingredient. So from that standpoint, anyone that's telling you, I need $10 million to finish a facility and I'm going to be the best grower in California, I mean, sure, do your due diligence, but I would question that more. And the other thing is just depending on where markets are. In Washington State right now, it's a fairly large market, but you're not allowed to be vertically integrated, and if you're a public company, for whatever reason, you're not allowed to show an economic variable interest to your investment, which means that your dispensaries can do $30 million a year, but you have to have the same management fee every quarter until you ratchet that up. So it's not very attractive from a standpoint of a public company investment or a private company that eventually wants to go public. And then markets like Oregon, where it's very hard to be profitable just because the regulators have allowed too many retailers to open up on seemingly every corner. So depends on what part of the value chain you're competing in and what geography.
Are there any black swan states that people don't have on their radar that could be game changers, like in New York?
There's a big one, and I don't know if it's on people's radar, but it's Texas, right? Because Texas right now only has sort of preliminary 5 or 6 licenses that might be utilized for a very, very, very modest medical market. And that's a market that eventually, at least in my view, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, probably one of the later ones, eventually if you have, close to all the states legalized, there's going to be political pressures for tax revenues and access to medicine and all those things. And that's a huge market. I mean, it's one of the bigger markets, probably not by percentage of usage, but certainly by population. So that's one where a lot of MSOs aren't talking about it publicly, but they're trying to line up if they can get one of those 5 or 6 preliminary licenses right now, so that because we all know in the sector when things move, it can move fast. As much as things get delayed, eventually things do start to accelerate. So that's one market. And another market that I'm very fond of, only as of the last 6 months when I really toured it, but I think it's on people's radar, is Pennsylvania. That's an incredible market in terms of what producers are allowed to manufacture there, what the ability for patients to get access right now. It's a medical only market for chronic pain and other things like that. So it's probably got 150,000 registered patients, so maybe half or 2/3 the size of Florida. And right now everyone's kind of just building out their first 3 or 4 dispensaries, so you don't have like a Trulieve yet that's dominating that market. But I think that's one of the top medical markets right now to keep your eyes on, outside of some of the sexier stories like Illinois and Massachusetts that are going recreational.
Great.
All right, Matt, that's a great contribution as per usual. Thanks very much for joining us
Yeah,
today.
take care.